To begin now. Welcome to LabX Summa Kicks LAC webinar, promoting the scalability of education innovations in Latin America and the Caribbean. And this is in the context of our innovation lab. My name is Maciel Morales, and I am a researcher of Geeks Lab, and I am going to be facilitating this space today. We would like to thank all of you for accepting this invitation, and we are beginning in just a few minutes. In the logic of being able to strengthen our multiculturalism, and we have asked the experts and speakers today to speak in their home language, taking consideration of those of you who are from different parts and different countries in Latin America, the Caribbean, and other parts of the world. You will be able to find on the bottom part of your screen a link for interpretation for English, French, and Spanish. We would like to remind you as well that this session will be recorded. I would also like to remind the audience that is listening to us that they can present themselves by placing their name, country, and institution in the chat. We would also like to invite you to write your questions and observations. And to begin now, I would like to share with you briefly that this webinar is within Lab Ed, which is the innovation lab whose purpose is to respond to priority problems and educational justice in the national systems of the KICLAC countries. How? By identifying, supporting, and dissemination of promising innovations in education with high impact potential. In the second call, we received 25 candidates. We had a representation of 10 countries, and we recognized 4 initiatives that today are a part of what is present today. So I would like to greet you and congratulate you once again. These 4 initiatives had financial help, the support from Kickstep, the monetary support, and also a workshop to generate sustainability plan. And they had a committee as well, and this is part of the Ministry of Education and the Academy. And we'd also like to thank those who are a part of these committees for their support and commitment, which is constant with the initiatives that are here in this lab today. And in this context we propose 2 workshops and webinars that have to do with the theory of change workshop, which was already carried out. And today we are with the second webinar, which has to do with scalability. And due to the context in the region that we work in, and thinking about the initiatives that are provisionary and can have a considerable impact in our students, it seems that it is key to think about and dialogue about making our projects scalable and how we can carry them out in different parts of the region. Once again, I would like to thank all of you for being here today, for the speakers and everybody who is on the call with us. And I would also like to comment that at the beginning, we will be able to listen to Javier Gonzalez, who is the director of SUMA, and he's affiliate professor of the Center of Development Studies in the University of Cambridge, and Brad Olson as well from the Brookings Institute. And as I said, Javier is the director of SUMA. He is from the University of Cambridge, and he is an affiliate of the Center of Development Studies of the same university. He has economy in the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, and he is also specialized in education and in different areas as well. And we would like to thank you, Javier, for being here with us today. And please go ahead.
¿Aló?
Ahí sí.
Perfecto. ¿Se ve mi PPT?
Se ve, pero no grande.
¿Ahí se ve mejor?
Ahí está, perfecto. Perfecto. Está.
¿En modo presentador o en modo...?
Perfect.
Está en modo presentación, está bien.
Está bien, perfecto. Muchas gracias.
Perfect then. Thank you very much, Maciel, and thank you to each of you who are here with us today. For us, it is tremendously important to have this activity and these things that we are talking about these things that we carry out here from Suma and also from our hub, Kicks LAC. And somehow what we are searching for is to improve our educational system, to make it more equal, have more equity and have better quality, more inclusive through innovation and through the search of new solutions, new ways of organizing our systems, our pedagogy, new ways of transforming our nucleus to be able to give answers to the challenges that the current society brings along with them. And within this, we have the Lab Ed, which is this initiative, as we were saying, in which they have received quite a bit of interest in the region in previous years. We have also carried this out in South America. And last year it was more focused in Central America and the Caribbean. And what we want is to be able to give a scenario, a voice, visibility, and also create certain capabilities to the world that is working on the field in things that are tremendously important in these different issues for our region, like for example education and being there on the ground, not in a way looking from above, but how these policies can be changed, how these programs, how these different areas can be changed into politics. And also therefore the question regarding how to scale these initiatives seems tremendously important. I would like briefly, in the few minutes that we have, I would like to share with you the challenge that it means to scale to include. It's not just to scale something just as for the sake of it, but it's to include. And why is this important? Because in our society, in Latin America and in the Caribbean, we know that inequality is one of our main pains. It's a historic wound that we have. So every action that we carry out in education and public policies in general, and this also has to do with the process of scaling, we have to have a vision regarding inclusion. Now, when we talk about scaling, what we talk about, and here you will see different players that are going to get maybe deeper or see different frameworks, but we're wanting to scale when you talk about this to be able to amplify the impact, to be able to generate transformation that is much deeper and long lasting over time, and to be able to institutionalize changes. And this scaling can come from different areas. It is not only from a state politics. Brookings, in some of the publications, have scaling that has been the school system, like in every area in the 19th century, they have been scaling the schools, the public schools. But you need to go beyond that even before. You have the Protestant religions that have scaled. For example, in Sweden, a great part of the population already knew how to read. Why? Because of cultural reasons. They scaled reading, you could say, from the obligation that every adult needs to know how to read the Bible. They had to be capable of reading the Bible for themselves, and that was a scaling that was verified by the religion, the Protestant organization, so where they would go to the adult homes, some to see if the adults could actually read or not. So this scaling is that you can see the learning of reading for a religious reason. So you can see sources of why this has happened over the different years. So you can see where it's a sort of science of scaling, and this science of how to generate more impact and higher transformation. In the core, in the heart of all of this, there are two concepts that are key that we need to take into consideration when we're talking about scaling. And one of them is efficacy, to be able to make sure reach the objective that we are wanting to reach and that it makes it worth scaling, the first question we need to ask, and also, does this solve a collective problem? Does it have that efficacy? Is it efficient enough that, or is that result that we are looking for? And this is a question before even thinking about scaling, almost like a condition. And if it's efficient, obviously you could have a result, but what is the cost? Maybe not even only financial cost. And what political sciences brings, which has to do with how this scaling can be efficient, having to do with transactional cost or from the transitional cost as well that we talk about in terms of politician issues or politician problems that could bring this scaling. Not, once again, it could be religious problems, it could be between ethnias, it could be another kind. Therefore, the solution that needs to be scaled has to be efficient, but also it has to have have efficacy and be efficient, not only because of the cost, but also in the sense that this transformation that we are wanting to cause can be accepted at a low cost of transition to be able to go from point A to B, where that B is that new transformation. And you could also think in different kinds of scaling, but at least you could think of two. There's different kinds of scaling, but I think the most recurring, or at least one that you could take into consideration, is the horizontal, having to do with replicating a model from one school to another school, and others has to do with this vertical. So it has to be from up down or down up. How you get deeper or into this program in the country. So I would like to make a distinction between what is programmatic and that is institutional. When we talk about scaling, you see the state kind of like a vendor or provider of programs. When the state is a point of encounter of channeling of different interests in the society, and therefore is also somehow the one who gives the framework or the rules and establishes the rules, and through its different powers, it has to do how we cohabit as well, whether it be macro or in a school system. The school system, whether it be public or private, who can access to the system, if it's free or paid, what are the requisites to go forward, what does the person who wins win? Do they go have access to higher education? When we talk about scaling, we think about a program, and that program is a practice or a way, and that can be amplified. And I think it's important to think when we talk about this, changes that are institutional. We don't talk so much about that when we talk about scaling, and it has to do with big changes, legal or cultural, that can be in a country where they change the rules of the game, and therefore you can think that maybe you can change certain rules or certain legal frameworks of a state in federal countries or in certain regions, and then they begin generating other kinds of institutionalities. So I want to question this pilot program that is expanded, because scaling can be another kind of thing as well. It can be something that is a regulatory framework expanding from one territory to another country. We're talking about a regional area, for example. And in this sense, I think, and we think in Summa, that the importance of the institutionalization of the changes, and it's not enough just to scale, just to replicate an initiative and to leave it in the air. But what's interesting is how this can be institutionalized in the country. And since we're talking about education, and education is a human right, and therefore the main guarantee player is is the state. So we need to recognize the role of the state for innovation and the different parts of scaling. So we talk about scaling the schools as technology, for example, in education. Well, we do it hand in hand with countries in the 19th century who wanted public education. The state is the one who has carried out the highest scaling of the history of human race. So it's important to see how many barriers exist in the society that are not only lack of financing or because the idea wasn't good. It can be a tremendously good education and the impact can be good. It can be efficient and effective, but it can cause political issues, ideological issues, or maybe it can cause problems, financial problems that requires more finances, cultural, technical issues. Maybe the country does not have the technical capability. So I think it's important for all of our innovators of our lab ed to take into consideration these things that doesn't have to do with the idea that my idea wasn't good enough and that's why they didn't take it up, but that there is a support to the scaling, but it is something that has to do with the fact that there are other barriers that we need to explore that has to do with the other political sciences or other technical issues. And due to time, I'm going to stay around here. And briefly, I would like to make a point of the importance of scaling to be able to include. Scaling sometimes can be seen as a standard systemization. And I would like to say that the point that I would like to leave on the table today is just to say that scaling implies the recognition, value, and mainly the construction on diversity. Therefore, it is a scaling process, implies standardization systematically of a practice. Not necessarily, but it is not contradictory that it scales, and the success of that is in the fact that as it scales, whether it be horizontally, vertically, functionally, or whichever way it might happen, it does it including and recognizing the different contexts. And when I say that word including, I'm using this definition that from Summa, that is from 2020 for Latin America, that has to do with this of recognizing and valuing and building over our differences. I would just like to say that. And basically, I think it is key in this world with the innovation that we can see it from the point of view of the financer, the seminar, and the social networks and all these media. And we forget that in reality, the success of scaling ends defining if we were able to understand the real problem that we want to solve in the way that we can interpret the problem from our society, and that can be with the institution or inequality. And then scaling will be easier because in general, the innovation will be much more united and down to earth with the real problems and not with an imposed agenda or a trend that can come from other regions of the world that says, oh, this is interesting, we could scale what is being scaled in Germany, for example. Well, because Chile, Guatemala, Haiti are not Germany, whether that be good or bad, they're different. So we can only scale as we can understand, as well as we can understand the problem that we want to create in our context. So thank you very much. And as I said, I hope we have a great afternoon.
Thank you for your presentation. So I'm rescuing many different points, interesting ones, but scaling for including, that is fundamental. I also feel that it is part of the heart, the core of us. We work for educational justice and also for including. It is interesting thinking, why do we need to scale? Not just for doing it, but the main goal of it is interesting. We need to keep in mind the barriers of that scaling, which is going to be done or developed. the incidences, and also understanding the real problem we're working for. That is something fundamental in order to develop a project with an impact in order to improve somehow the educational systems in the region. So thank you very much for your intervention, Javier. Once again, we acknowledge these four initiatives which are part of this, which also work for this, for educational justice, and also for having better results in the educational systems. Wide results. Remember that you can also write your questions, your comments, observations in the chat box. We'll try to read them all in the Q&A session. So now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Brad Olson, doctor in education from California University and master's degree from Harvard University. His research are centered in the professional scholar reform and qualitative research methods. He's a researcher, main researcher of the Center for Universal Education in the Economy and Development Institute. His work is aimed in the research of policies around the widening of innovation in education for the systemic improvement in the countries with low income and medium low income. His presentation today, it is titled Lessons to Scale Innovations in Developing Countries. Brad, the floor is all yours. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Muchas gracias. Buenas tardes a todos. I wish that I could speak better Spanish than I can, but I'm going to speak in English. But I'm so happy to be here, and I want to thank the Latin America and Caribbean group and SUMA. This is a real pleasure. My name is Brad Olson, and I work at the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution, where I work on a project called ROSI. ROSI stands for Research on Scaling the Impact of Innovations in Education. And this is part of the KICS initiative, which you all probably know well. And so I therefore also want to thank the Global Partnership for Education and the International Development Research Center for their support and their creation of KICS. What I want to do for a few minutes is talk about what it means to scale a promising education innovation. I really appreciate Dr. Gonzalez for talking a little bit about what scaling is and why it's so important. And so I want to build on some of the things that he has said to kind of define how we think about scaling within the work around ROSI and KICS, and then to talk about how one should think about scaling from the beginning of the process of designing and developing an innovation. Next slide, please. And so the question to begin with is, what do we mean by scaling? Oftentimes, scaling gets reduced to making something have a larger reach, to expanding the reach or the coverage of a thing. And sometimes that is true, but it's not always true. When we talk about scaling, what I think we're talking about is how can we embed a promising innovation so that it becomes part of the everyday practices, part of the everyday system within education, so that it improves lives for children, for families, and for communities. And to me, that's about scaling for impact and scaling for equity. Next slide, please. And so in ROSI, we define scaling as a range of approaches that expand and deepen impact and equity, leading to lasting improvements in people's lives. This is the idea that if done well, the innovation will be embedded into everyday use so that it impacts the whole system and that it becomes a new normal for the people who engage in it. Next slide, please. The KICS stance and the ROSI stance on scaling has 5 particular principles. The first one is that scaling is not linear. There used to be a misunderstanding that to scale a promising innovation was simply about rolling it out and that it would sort of take off on its own, that it was a technical process, that it was a purely rational process, and that it was a forward-moving linear process. That's not really true. In fact, It's a complex, non-linear process. The scaling pathway or the scaling journey might move in one direction, and then it might move into another direction. Sometimes it might be a few steps forward, but then one step back. Sometimes the scaling has to pause for a while, for maybe perhaps there's been a new administration that comes in and then starts again. And in some ways, it kind of circles back on itself. And so the process of scaling should not be understood as linear or purely technical. Secondly, it's not only about coverage. It's not only about expansion. We see scaling as about creating deep and lasting impact that improves people's lives. The third part of this, which is related, is that we understand scaling to be integrated with systems transformation. Education is a giant system, and it consists of multiple moving parts or levers or components. And it's the interaction among the parts that creates the conditions for education. And so a promising innovation that's going to be scaled will be scaled into the education system in a way where, in many cases, it will attach itself to the system such that it changes and improves the way the system works. An education innovation could strengthen a system, it could make a system more efficient, or it could disrupt and transform a system. Depends on the goal and it depends on the innovation. Fourthly, context matters. It's wrong to believe that an innovation that works in one place can be automatically picked up and put into a new place and it will work the same way. In fact, the conditions of each context will change and will adapt the way the innovation gets used and therefore its success. And so the work of scaling a promising innovation has to require contextualizing the innovation for actual use within the unique characteristics of the particular context in mind. We call this contextualization. I'll return to it a little bit later, but I think it's incredibly important. And then finally, there's no magic recipe. There's no silver bullet for how to do scaling. It's not that there's one model and one simply follows it. Instead, it's complex. It requires principles. It requires adaptation. There are decades of history and cases and research, and sometimes it's a lot of trial and error as one might engage successfully in the scaling of a promising innovation. Next slide, please. Rob McLean and John Gargani talk about scaling in a way using the metaphor of an apple tree. So there is vertical scaling, and vertical scaling, as Dr. Gonzalez said, is about building the innovation up into higher levels of the system. That may very well be including it in the government system. We'll talk about that in a moment. Or it could be moving it down into deeper dimensions of the system. One way of thinking about that is if you have an apple tree, you could actually create a bigger apple tree that might produce more fruit. A second way of thinking about scaling is horizontal scaling. The idea here is to expand the effect and the impact of the innovation. So that might be, whoops, not quite yet. That might be planting more apple trees in order to get more fruit. And then there's also the notion of scaling deep. And scaling deep might be the ability to actually create a better apple tree that produces better or more fruit. These are three different ways to achieve impact at scale. Next slide, please. And so therefore, we can think about four different pathways to scale. The horizontal pathway is to affect more people in more places with the innovation. The vertical scaling is to build it up, oftentimes into the policy framework of the location. When a promising innovation from outside government is scaled vertically into the government system, we call that institutionalization. We might talk about that in a minute. A third pathway to scale is organizational scaling, where the scaling of the innovation actually strengthens the capacity for the system or for the organization to do its work well. And then fourthly, we can talk about functional scaling, where the ability of the scaling the promising innovation is to offer more activities and more opportunities for success within a system or within an organization. Next slide, please. Larry Cooley and others at MSI talk about the process of scaling in terms of 3 phases. The first phase, which they use an acorn metaphor, is that one needs to develop a scaling plan. And this is to create an idea about how the scaling of the innovation will work. What I'm going to talk about in a moment is that it becomes incredibly important to think about scaling from the beginning. At the very point where one is thinking about the innovation, thinking about how to design and develop the innovation, that is the time to begin thinking about scaling, not after the innovation has been designed and developed and piloted, because then it's a different kind of innovation. If scaling can be considered from the start, it has a much better chance of scaling success later on. The second, if that first part is the acorn, the second step is the roots. And the roots is about creating the preconditions for scaling, making sure that there is an enabling environment in the larger context. That includes engaging champions and partners. It means making sure that the policy context is amenable, identifying windows of opportunity, thinking about the financing, thinking about the structure of the scaling process and the scaling team. And then thirdly, and only finally, does the actual beginning of the scaling proceed. And so one can think about it in those 3 phases or those 3 steps. Another way to think about it, next slide, please. And this comes from the International Development Innovation Alliance. And here's the idea that it's a 7-step process. I won't go into the details here, and I'll call your attention to the circles behind it to remind us that it is not necessarily a clearly linear process. But there is this understanding, and I think it's a good one, to think about phases of the process of scaling. Next slide, please. The Center for Universal Education here at Brookings was very interested in doing case research retrospectively of several scaling initiatives that seemed to have worked. And what they did was they wanted to look at why those worked. And in doing so, created a study of 14 different core ingredients that appear to contribute to scaling quality learning. And these show up in a document. You're welcome to find that document on our website if you wish. We have it in French, we have it in English, and we have it in Spanish. And so these are 14 principles of practice that we might think about as we pursue the work of scaling. I don't have the time to go into all of them right now, but there are a couple of that I'd like to highlight. Next slide, please. One of them is the need to fall in love with the problem, not the solution. It becomes too easy to become so focused on the innovation and go searching for some kind of a problem that it might solve. But the truth of the matter is that the focus of this should be, what is the deep problem in the location that you all might be trying to address? And once you figure out what that problem is, ask yourself why that problem exists. And then once you have an answer for that, ask yourself why that set of conditions exists. And then ask yourself why again and again and again. Larry Cooley talks about the need to ask the question why 5 times. It should be almost an obsession that keeps you awake at night. What is the problem here? And what are the levels below the problem that can be addressed by the innovation that we're thinking about? Next slide, please. As I mentioned before, it's incredibly important to plan for scale from the start. Right from the beginning, think about what it will mean to scale this, because that way the scaling process is built into the design and the development of the innovation itself. We have this image of a car here that's got perhaps too many wheels and too many lights, and it's a little too flashy and a little too fancy. And I think what that is trying to suggest is that if you have too complex of an innovation, it's going to be very difficult to scale. Simple innovations that have a core that is incredibly important will scale more easily because they can be adapted, they can be owned and used by others along the way. And I think what this means is it's better to have 100% scaling of only 70% of your innovation than not be able to scale at all 100% of your innovation. In other words, you may have to sacrifice or let go parts of an innovation so that the core can last. And the innovation might be just an idea. And the scaling is a container to embed the idea in practice. The innovation could be an approach, it could be a technology, it could be an innovation. Larry Cuban writes about how the decision in the 19th century to unbolt the student desks from the floor of the classroom was a radical innovation. And so I think it's useful to think of innovations sometimes as small but profound differences that can be scaled into a system so as to achieve high impact and high equity. Moving on, please. I know I have just 1 minute left. It's important to co-design the innovation with the users to make sure that it's the teachers and the students and the parents and the community members who are actually part of the process of creating the innovation, so that when it comes time for them to use and scale it, they will understand it, they will support it, and they will do a really important job of embedding it into their daily life. Next slide, please. And then finally, it becomes important to build a winning coalition. And what we mean by that is that a scaling team alone will have only limited success. It becomes incredibly important right from the beginning to engage champions, policymakers, researchers, community activists, teachers unions, school leaders, families, and others, so that firstly, there's more support for the innovation as it scales. Secondly, there's an actual broad coalition that can offer feedback and that can help think through what it means to do the scaling work. And then finally, you have champions who will help the process along the way. Next slide, please. And then I just want to end by saying this work requires constant adaptation and learning by doing and collecting data so that you can course correct and pivot and change the process of scaling your innovation along the way. The plan for scaling that you start with is probably not the one that's ultimately going to take you all the way there. Instead, it's going to need to change and be changed along the way. And it becomes incredibly important that you have an organizational stance of openness, continual learning, and constant course correction. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Brad, por tu presentación.
Thank you, Brad, for your presentation. It is really interesting to see all of these key elements, all of these tips on how to scale a project. I want to rescue two things. We need to fall in love with the problem, not the solution. And that makes me think when we work on a thesis work, you have to fall in love with the problem, the topic you're going to work with, because it gives you the engine to get really far away and maybe to scale, do the scaling. Herman also said, and maybe he wants to go deeper into that, but he was also saying, instead of falling in love with a problem, you need to fall in love with a dream in order to make that dream scalable. That is also really beautiful, so poetic. And one more thing, Brad, that I think is really important. I mean, it is this about getting the community involved. They're going to participate into this innovation. They need to understand, we need to understand, and we need to co-design this innovation with the participants, with, the stakeholders, actors. That's fundamental. Always considering who this is going to be for, and we need to make those people part, horizontally, hopefully, all of the people who are participating in the project. Thank you very much, Brad. Thank you very much, Javier. So now I'd like to give the floor for questions, observations, comments. Maybe Herman, you were there commenting in the chat. Maybe you want to comment something to everyone.
Maciel, muchas gracias. Thank you, Maciel. Thank you. Also for what you just shared, Brad, which makes us reflect. At one moment, you talked about 4 paths. I was imagining and dreaming a little bit about our reality, and I was asking myself if during the scaling we can also combine the 4 paths. That's why I put 4 paths of one that are part of the 4 lanes of one path, maybe not parallel. Sometimes they might cross over, but it's the combination. Like, for example, I could say if you scale horizontally, you also need to have a scaling regarding capabilities. executive capability of the organization. And also, maybe to be able to do it horizontally, we also need the approval of the educational politics, which is vertical. So that's one of the questions. And on the other hand, Maciel already mentioned it. Instead of starting from a problem, why not start with a dream, which is pretty much the same, because the dream of a non-resolved problem, and we want it to become a resolved problem. But talking about a dream, it's nice to dream. It's a positive focus that we could promote in scaling. And the other element of co-designing, so I was thinking about our vision, how essential it is to have cooperation. And also it says that winning coalition, and this of winning and losing doesn't go with us. I don't know if the correct word is winning. If you have winners, that means there's losers, and we don't need losers. So we could also talk about a cooperation or productive that's what your exposition provoked in me. Thank you so much.
Yeah, those are great thoughts, and I won't take up too much time, but your first point around couldn't the four pathways intertwine? They could very well. I think that it really depends on the context, it depends on the purpose, it depends on the innovation itself, but we don't necessarily need to see them as four distinct ways. I think what becomes incredibly important is to be strategic about how the pathway is going to work in the particular location. And sometimes teams will take on too much, and especially at the beginning, and that can become problematic. Secondly, why start with a problem? Couldn't we necessarily start with a dream? That's very possible, and that could be true. I think the reason for focusing on an identified problem has a lot to do with the need to engage policymakers to care. And policymakers are focused on the kind of agenda items in the sector plan, in the educational plan. Oftentimes it's a relatively bureaucratic, I wouldn't say purely rational process. And so I don't think you're wrong. And I think it's wonderful to dream. I would never tell anyone not to dream. But I think the notion of focusing on the problem is oftentimes about how it's easier to receive support at the central government level. And then the third notion about winning, I wonder if this might be a translational issue, because I'm intending winning as an adjective, not as a verb. It's not about winning versus losing. It's about the kind of coalition that has a successful mindset and that can leverage its use for further scaling. But I certainly don't want to create any kind of winning, losing binary. Thank you, Herman.
Gracias, Germán. Gracias, Brad. Santiago.
Thank you, Herman. Thank you, Brad. Santiago, you also asked some questions in the chat. Would you like to say them?
How are you doing, Brad? So nice to meet you. Michael Fullen says hello. He knew I was joining this session, so he sends his rewards. I think one thing that we will agree on is a lot of, well, first, thank you for the marvelous summary. It's a very clear, very concise understanding of scaling that I find very helpful. Now, one thing that I have come to conclude is that a lot of the innovations that make good, powerful learning happen run counter to the logic of institutional logic of schools and school systems. They go against the grain. They're countercultural. They go against the grain of the ways most schools and education systems operate. Knowing that, you know, the command and control logic culture is very prevalent in many educational systems, but in particular in Latin America. So my question is, what have you learned from all, you know, from all the work you have been doing around monitoring and supporting scaling up, about what it takes and what are the possibilities for transforming systems in ways that they become not only tolerating to innovation that goes against the grain, but that actually embed them in their own logic of functioning, in their own way of functioning? That's my question.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you for asking it. I think that the sort of long and complex answer has to do with mutual adaptation and about the fact that the innovations are always being changed by the system at the same time the systems are being changed by the innovation. And so it's certainly there's a constant kind of process of organic change going on. But perhaps the more bounded answer has to do with it's incredibly difficult, isn't it? And I think that sometimes the innovations actually set out to transform a system, but they end up reinforcing the system. And so one needs to be very careful about what they expect to do, what the innovation is able to do. And I think there's something really interesting about thinking through the extent to which an innovation is going to attach itself to the larger system. Is it going to do so in a way that reinforces the system, or is it going to do so in a way that either transforms or even exposes the weaknesses or the inequities of the system? And so there are different kinds of innovations and there are different kinds of scaling approaches that will do different kinds of things. Just very quickly, and I know your work, and I think that you've looked at this before, and I think of Escuela Nueva as a good example of something that may have initially sought to change the system and maybe did so in some very powerful ways, but then eventually got brought into the system in a way that its efficacy or its usefulness may have been altered. And so I kind of think of the metaphor of driving a car, and you can't let your foot off the accelerator. One has to keep pushing the innovation through the scaling so that it pushes the system and that it actually disrupts or transforms it rather than gets absorbed into it.
Muchas gracias, Brad, por tu respuesta y comentarios. Yo sé que quizás hay muchos
Thank you,
más.
Brad, for your answer and comments. I know that there could be many more questions, but due to time, and we are going to continue now with the webinar. If you have any more questions, or I don't know, maybe Javier, you would like to make a last comment? So if you have any more questions or comments, you can write them in the chat and we will be trying to respond to those somehow. But now we would like to present Rosny, who is going to share with us some words regarding scaling. I'm going to present Rosny Peña, who is master in teaching in studies in Latin America and Caribbean. He has a history specialty and he is part of the research department in the Ministry of Education of Nicaragua. He's a member of different research organizations in Nicaragua and also part of the committee of LAC. He will share with us his vision regarding the importance and the need of scaling local projects. Thank you very much, Rosny. Good afternoon to each of you. To talk about scalability, I'm going to start up with some of the elements that those who came before me talked about. That one of the successes of scaling processes has to do with understanding or interpreting the social problems, looking for the solution. But not only that, but also something interesting is the acceptance. And what Herman also mentioned, an element of co-construction of the solution so that it's not only a process of imposition, but it can be articulated with a main character, with the people who are in the different territories, understanding the needs to be able to find a solution through projects, through needs, and who are going to give answers to this and give effectivity to the scaling process. It's going to be those peoples, the main characters. And in the case here, it's the protagonists who are going to see in the processes of scalability they are going to see the solution to their needs. And therefore there we will have that projection from the scaling projects in which were mentioned to be able to facilitate the state and the state policies and in the practices in redirecting some elements that may not have been so effective. But through the processes of scaling, We get the ideas, options to be able to put into practice and be able to broaden that process, because we need to take into consideration the difference between what is to scale and what is to replicate. Because in the case of scaling, success is within that, it takes into consideration the main character, the protagonist, and replicating has to do with the imposition without taking in the cultural, geographical, or different contexts in which that project is going to take place. While through these elements, there's going to be a recognition, and like in the case of the territory, it is what is going to allow the process. In the case of Nicaragua, or to be more specific, we have projects in which you can include the different protagonists, and not only the protagonists, but something interesting that it was mentioned, the case of elements of scalability, and that is the integration or function of the putting into practice of a project, and as well as the policies of the different systems, including the state, which include putting in projects into practice in which you include the authorities, for example, the government, into the educational system, to not be distant, but to be articulate through the educational system, to be able to give an answer, not from the point of view in a separate way, but united, integrated, to be able to give a solution, and that we can look to be able to have those elements in common. Another element that can be present and that we can take into consideration in the processes of scalability has to do with their own elements. I'm talking about the case of, in particular, the school absence. So we're going to work on it. We're going to mention it. But those who are in a territory, I'm going to place an example. In the north, it's not the same as in the western due to the geographical, financial elements. You have to take those into consideration to see what is affecting the barriers that Javier was mentioning, the barriers of scaling. And there you have the financial part as well. You have the political part. You have the cultural part, the practices, to be able to understand people, to understand the protagonists, to be able to give solutions. Thank you very much for your point of view. It is so important to have that articulation where that is very interesting, this between the initiatives that are from non-governmental or organization with articulated with those of the government, of the ministry. We have many representatives of the ministries that are part of the follow-up committee that has also pushed the initiatives, and once again has helped them to be able to be scalable. So we are now reaching the end of our webinar. Due to time, we would like to thank each of the guests, and we would like to also invite you to respond to a short interview that my colleagues are going to place in the chat. These are in French, English, and Spanish. It's very short, only to know your opinion of this space and how we can improve it so that it can be better for all of us. And to be able to close now, we would like to invite Lisa Sargusin-Terrans, I hope I said that adequately, who is the technical specialist in education in the development of education in the Commission in the Caribbean. She works in a specialist in the early learning program, and as a technical specialist of the program having to do with COVID-19. So she is going to give us a few words. Go ahead, please. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. I know time is against us, but good afternoon and greetings from the OECS Commission and all the ministries of education that we represent in the Eastern Caribbean. Special thanks to Suma Kicks for this really important webinar. I just need to tell you that the vision of the OECS education sector strategy is every learner succeeds. Therefore, it is really important that as we plan our innovations, that we really try to cast a wide net so that all our students are positively impacted. I mean, admittedly, some of our projects in the region, our innovations, they seem to be like a one-off with an end period. And we go through quite a few challenges sometimes in sustaining them. But we appreciate that, as Brad says, it is something that we have to think of from the very beginning, the whole notion of scalability, from conceptualization, from design of our projects. So having said that, really, I want to thank you, Brad, for sharing these very important lessons for scaling our innovations. There are some key things that have resonated with me. I think you spoke to the notion of co-creation. I think you call it co-designing, and that is something that we are employing right now in the commission. I think, Rosin, you also emphasized the need for that collaborative undertaking of our projects. So thank you so much for the two of you for bringing all of these important points to the fore. Just to share with you one more point, for us in the region, we understand that scalability requires a space for partnerships. And we do have something that is working well for us that I would like to share. It is our Education Partners Forum, a platform where we bring together all our development partners so that they can collaborate on our projects. There are a few areas that we definitely need to work on in the Eastern Caribbean as it pertains to scalability, but this is one of the things I can tell you is really working for us. So we have noted all of the lessons and the reflection, and I can tell you that we will be taking consideration of all of these as we aim for multiple impact and deep impact of our innovations. So thank you again, Suma, and to the presenters for this opportunity for sharing. And we do hope that we will continue on this topic of scalability. So thank you again, and do have a productive day, everyone. It was such a pleasure listening to you.
Muchas gracias, Lisa, y gracias sobre todo por tenerte en el tiempo. Yo sé que estamos
Thank you, and thank you for this opportunity to have you. We would like to all continue speaking, and I know that we are now ending our webinar, but we have one more comment from EFE, from Haiti, and we would like maybe, I don't know if you are available so that you could make the comment with all of us, because we are very interested to be able to hear the voice of Haiti, that due to connectivity and other issues, sometimes it's very hard to hear your voice. Hervé, I don't know if you're available to speak.
Bueno, si no, rápidamente puedo leer el comentario.
If not, I can read his comment quickly.
Bueno, me voy a tomar, voy a permitir solamente leer lo que Hervé nos compartía en el chat, que es muy interesante.
So I'm going to share what he wrote in the chat, because it helps us understand what is happening in Haiti and the social and political financial problems that they are living in that country. So he asked, in these difficult contexts, where the conditions are so complicated, how can we scale innovation if we do not have the conditions in education area to do so? I think that this can be an open reflection that in places so complex and difficult as where I am, the right of education is not as present, or it's more difficult to carry out. How can we think about innovating and that the projects may be innovative? Once again, I would like to place the context to be taken into consideration, but I would also like to think about these territories that maybe have many more difficulties. I don't know if anybody else would like to make a last comment, since I already took this opportunity to be able to interpret ahead of it. If not, I would like to thank each of you for participating. We would like to remind you that at this time after the webinar, we have a workshop regarding scalability that is focused for those who are working Lab Ed and the follow-up committees. So for Lab Ed, we continue with the same link. We are going to make a 3-minute pause, and then we will continue with the workshop. And for all of the participants, we would like to thank you once again. We are very happy to be with this instance, to be able to participate. And thank you so much.